today's discussion is on monopoly. So when we look at monopoly, monopoly is again another spectrum of perfect competition. So if we have perfect competition here, monopoly falls at the right opposite. And for our discussion, we're considering pure monopoly. Pure monopoly is when there is only one firm. Okay, so we'll look at this analysis from a pure monopoly perspective. And we have monopolistic competition. So we have monopolistic competition closer to perfect competition, and then we have when you look at monopolistic competition, that's closer to perfect competition versus oligopoly would be closer to pure monopoly. And we're looking at from the idea that perfect competition has many firms, right? Monopolistic competition has also many firms, but perfect competition has much more firms. Oligopoly has few firms, and monopoly has one firm. And just to give a quick comparison of the various market structures, perfect competition has no barrier to entry and exit. So there is no barrier to entry or exit. Similarly here there is no barrier as well. While in oligopoly there are strong barriers, while in pure monopoly we assume that the entry is impossible. So in our model, we're doing an extreme case where the entry is impossible for pure monopoly. Similarly, it comes to the other idea, which is that what kind of products are they selling? In perfect competition, you have an identical product. In monopolistic competition, you have a differentiated product. So there is a difference between perfect competition and monopolistic competition. I think this is the biggest difference, that one is selling identical product versus differentiated product. And in oligopoly, you have sometimes differentiated products, but sometimes, like cars would be differentiated products, but you could also have identical products as well sometimes, like in sugar industry, there would be identical product, which is also found in oligopoly. Pure monopoly, on the other hand, has what we call a unique product. You're the only seller in the market. And because of this, if you look at perfect competition, you have a perfectly elastic demand curve, which we saw in earlier lecture as well, perfectly elastic demand curve. In monopolistic competition, you have what we call a very elastic demand curve. Not perfectly elastic, very elastic demand curve. Why not perfectly elastic? Because you have some brand loyalty that is coming from differentiated product. Okay, so there is a very elastic demand curve because of some differentiation of the product. You can't have perfectly elastic demand curve. And in oligopoly, you have a very inelastic curve, because there is very few firms, so the competition is less. In monopoly, you don't have perfectly inelastic curve, but you also have a very inelastic curve, more so in oligopoly than in oligopoly. Why don't you have a perfectly inelastic curve? And the reason is simply because consumers are not, it's not like a life-saving drug where the consumer will pay any price for it. And that's why it's not where the consumer would, if the price is too high, consumer may stop consuming your good. Had it been a life-saving drug that the monopoly was selling, yes, we could argue this, that probably the demand is very sort of a perfectly inelastic, right? There's also one more discussion we can quickly do, is just that you could have supernormal profits here, supernormal profits in the short run, but you could have normal profit, pie for profit in the long run. While on the other hand, monopoly would have a monopolistic competition would have the same scenario. Supernormal profit in the short run, but normal profit in the long run. And the reason is simply because of the no barriers to entry. The no barriers to entry makes the profits to eliminate for both the perfect competition and monopolistic competition in the long run. So remember this, that both perfect competition and monopolistic competition make normal profits in the long run, but they can make supernormal profits in the short run. Yeah, makes sense? On the other hand, oligopoly can make supernormal profits in the short and long run. And similarly, monopoly can also make supernormal profit in the short run and long run. So there is the barriers to entry. The barriers to entry are strong, and that makes it difficult for new firms to entry, and that can help you safeguard your profits both in the short run and in the long run. Okay, so let's start to look at equilibrium for monopoly. So when you look at equilibrium, equilibrium doesn't really differentiate for monopoly in the short run or in the long run. So if we draw a demand curve, if we draw a sort of a curve, we will make a downward sloping demand curve because monopoly is the only firm in the industry. And when you have a downward sloping demand curve, the MR is below your demand curve. Okay, so your demand curve and MR are originating from the same place. This is my demand curve, this is my MR, and demand curve is above my MR. Why is my MR below my demand curve? Well, the logic is very simple, that when you sell an extra unit, we have to lower the price. When your demand curve is downward sloping, when you sell an extra unit, let's say if this is my demand curve, if I sell an extra unit, for example, my price was 10, I was selling 5 units. If I want to sell the 6th unit, I need to lower my price. So what's my revenue for 5 units? It's 10 times 5, which is $50. What's my revenue for the 6th unit? It's 9 times 6. What is 9 times 6? 50? 54, right? But look at this. Your price is, so what's your MR? MR is equal to 54 minus 50 or 4. Your price was 9, but your MR is 4. So demand is always your price or AR. Your MR will always be lower because when you sell an extra unit, you need to lower the price. So your MR, your extra revenue will always be lower than the price you sell it for. You may sell it for a particular price, but your MR will be lower because you will make lower revenue for the extra units. Next comes your marginal cost. We'll make our marginal cost like the way we've been making marginal cost. MC is equal to MR would mean I will make Q1. MC is equal to MR is the profit maximization rule. So we will do MC is equal to MR, and when we do that, we will make this quantity Q1 at the price P1. Okay, so that's what we will do when that's the quantity. Now, before Q1, MR is greater than MC, so we will again produce more. After Q1, MR is less than MC, so we'll produce less. Right? But at MC is equal to MR, that's when we maximize profit. But how much profit do we maximize? And for that, we'll make our ATC curve. And the answer would be at Q1, this is the cost of making, so this is my ATC, this is my price P1. So my ATC is here, my price is P1 here. So this rectangle would be my supernormal profit. So in a monopoly situation, my profit would be equal to P minus ATC times Q. Okay, so in a monopoly, your P minus ATC times Q would mean profit would happen at this. So this is my short run situation, but this will also be my long run situation because I can make profit not only in the short run but also in the long run. But the rule remains MC is equal to MR, which is profit maximizing level of output. So that will just make me decide how much profit will I make. Let's talk about the monopoly and public interest, basically pros and cons of monopoly. The first, let's discuss the disadvantages of monopoly. the first disadvantage of monopoly that we want to talk about is basically monopoly is allocatively inefficient. So let's talk about allocative inefficiency that happens in a monopoly. And I want to draw the diagram again to compare monopoly with perfect competition. Basically, when you look at perfect competition versus monopoly, we're comparing perfect competition industry with monopoly industry. Right? So, if this is a demand curve and MR curve, my marginal cost is here. Now, if this same industry was under perfect competition, remember demand is your price. If this same industry was under perfect competition, we would have produced where demand and supply were equal. Remember, MC is also supply under perfect competition. So this is equal to supply under perfect competition. But in monopoly, this is not the supply curve. In monopoly doesn't have a supply curve. But in this case, MC is equal to price. Perfect competition would have produced at PC and the quantity would have been QC, which would mean P is equal to MC under perfect competition. So let's call this point A. Monopoly would have produced where MC is equal to MR. So monopoly's output would have been here. QM would be the output because MC is equal to MR is happening at, let's call this point B, and the price would have been PM. So what you can see that is perfect competition is not only a monopoly is not only charging a higher price, but it's also producing a lower quantity. And because of this, you are losing out on output, but also there's a deadweight loss. So if I label these regions as area 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we can see this that the consumer surplus is in perfect competition, consumer surplus is 1 plus 2 plus 3, producer surplus is 4 plus 5. While under monopoly, consumer surplus is 1 only, consumer surplus is only 1, producer surplus is 2 plus 5, and the deadweight loss, which is happening because I'm not producing at P equals to MC, but I'm producing at the point B where P is greater than MC, is actually 3 plus 4. So in other words, this whole area is my deadweight loss. Area 3 plus 4 is my deadweight loss. So monopoly charges a higher price and produces a lower quantity, and that leads to what we call the deadweight loss. So it's monopoly is allocatively inefficient. Are you all with me? So that's the first thing we want to talk about, that monopoly is not allocatively efficient, but in fact it's allocatively inefficient. The next point that we want to talk about is this: monopoly is not only allocatively inefficient, but it could also be productively inefficient. And the logic that we actually say is this, that when you look at a monopolies diagram, if we quickly look at a monopolies diagram, monopolies produces where MC is equal to MR. If this is my ATC, one of the arguments that's raised is this, that if you want to reduce your cost, if you want to produce at the lowest possible cost, you produce where MC is equal to MR, where price is P1, quantity is Q1. But if you really want to produce at the lowest possible cost, this is the least cost output level. So one of the arguments that is raised is that monopoly may not produce at the least cost output level, and as a result they could be productively inefficient. Remember where the MC curve meets the ATC curve, that's the point where ATC is minimum, and that's happening at Q2. The monopoly produces where MC is equal to MR, so it doesn't really care about what the cost is. Make sense? So producing at where demand equals MC is allocatively efficient, which is this point, but producing at the lowest point of the ATC would be your productively efficient point, and that's why you're not only productively efficient when it comes to monopoly. So the next thing we want to talk about is basically monopoly also has another problem, which is called XInefficiency. XInefficiency basically means that monopoly is also sometimes inefficient due to lack of competition. So inefficiency that happens due to lack of competition is called XInefficiency. So for example, monopoly can produce at a lower cost. Let's say if I'm a very efficient monopoly, I can produce at this. So this is my LRAC of a efficient monopoly. But because I don't have any competition, I may not invest in my in my capital. I may decide to have a higher cost because I know the competition is not taking away my profits. So why care about? So a lot of these public utilities like government owned nationalized industries sometimes have a higher cost than otherwise because of lack of competition. PIA we saw was also one of those companies where one would argue this, the lack of competition has made them inefficient. Okay, so these are the three disadvantages we want to talk about. There is another fourth disadvantage sometimes people mention, which is that monopoly, when it becomes too powerful, it can actually cause income distribution to become unfair. So that's the fourth one if you want to write that. Okay, but let's talk about quickly the advantages of monopoly. The first advantage of monopoly when it comes to the monopoly structure is that monopoly sometimes has what we call economies of scale. And this is a big advantage, something which was ignored in the disadvantage. So I want to make that graph again that we were making, this time around showing some economies of scale to happen. So let's say this is my supply curve under perfect competition, which is also the marginal cost curve, right? Under perfect competition, let's say monopoly is enjoying economies of scale. So perfect competition would produce at price PC and the quantity would be QC. Okay. Now I'm going to make my MR curve because MR matters when it comes to your monopoly. But let's say monopoly is enjoying significant economies of scale. So monopoly's cost is here. MC for monopoly. MC is equal to MR would mean monopoly would produce QM. So a higher output. If there is economies of scale happening, which means you have a lower marginal cost, you'll produce at a much higher output, and your price can also be lower than perfect competition. The problem with perfect competition is that there are many small firms producing a lot of output. But monopoly, one single firm enjoying significant economies of scale can produce a much higher scale of output, enjoy economies of scale, the cost can be lower. The cost can be lower, resulting in lower price and higher quantity. In the older analysis for the disadvantage, we did not account for economies of scale. But if we account for economies of scale, one could argue the monopoly can offer lower prices and higher quantity if economies of scale is taking place. So it could be actually beneficial as compared to perfect competition. The second advantage that we want to point out for monopoly is basically to do with what we call possibility of lower cost and therefore higher output due to higher investment in research and development. There is a strong argument that is raised is that monopoly would probably be investing more primarily because of the fact that they can make higher supernormal profits. Like the lower your cost, the higher your profit. And if that's the case, the monopoly can basically be argued is not necessarily productively inefficient because, or even like XInefficient because they have an incentive to make supernormal profits. So one could argue this that you might, if there is any market structure who can invest in R&D, that's monopoly. Because other markets, or even oligopoly, because other market structures may not have the money to start off with to invest in these investments and other things.
Is that dynamic efficiency?
Dynamic is the third point. Dynamic efficiency basically argues this that monopoly is also dynamically efficient. And the dynamic efficiency argument says this that here you are basically investing in new products to remain sort of market leader. And not only to remain market leader, but also to make sure to ensure that the monopoly position remains. Basically, what we argue this is that if there is a new firm that can enter, that new firm can break away your market or take away consumers from you. And in order to make sure that this doesn't happen, you have to become better every year. You need to keep on investing. Basically, if you become complacent, there will be another new firm that can come and take your market over. That happened with Microsoft. That happened with, for example, even like in the cell phone market, Nokia also suffered from that. Nokia was a market leader. Now with the smartphone markets, they weren't good enough. Apple and Samsung and even HTC took away their market. So the idea goes this that dynamic efficiency would argue this that in order to remain a monopoly, you keep on investing so that you can have better products. And that would mean that, so why is it called dynamic? So monopoly, this is an important point, monopoly may not be efficient on on sort of on productive or allocative level, but in the long run it gives better products because they have an incentive to remain a monopoly, and that's why it is dynamically efficient. Next discussion that I want to have is basically how do we control monopoly. Controlling monopoly. This comes a lot in MCQs, so it's worth discussing that. Controlling monopoly basically means can we charge, control prices for monopoly in a way so that they can actually become more productively or allocatively efficient. So one of the ways that you can do that is through simply rules and regulations. Okay, which is basically laws that you can put in order to make sure that monopoly tries to charge a better price. But another common way is to basically put what we call price controls. So how does price control work? So we can basically, let's draw this diagram. Let's say if Abhi monopoly is doing profit maximization. So this is my demand, this is my MR, and let's say monopoly is doing this. Okay, MC is equal to MR, so monopoly is charging QM, price is PM. So what you could do is this, you can just say this, that now monopoly will be forced to charge like a maximum price like this one. Okay, when you do that, this will now become the new price. This becomes the new price, PX, and that's why this becomes my new demand curve as well. Why would this become my new demand curve? Because what happens is this, when you force the monopoly to charge this price, this demand curve is no longer valid. Automatically this would mean this becomes my new demand curve or price. Now that would mean this becomes also my new MR curve. Why? Because when you fix the price like this one, demand becomes perfectly elastic. For a perfectly elastic demand curve, this becomes my new MR as well. Remember, when your demand curve is downward sloping, MR is below demand curve. But when your demand curve is like perfectly elastic, this becomes my new MR as well. So that would mean MC is equal to MR would now happen here. You would be charging a lower price or forcing the monopoly to charge a lower price and also make them produce a higher quantity. So basically you can put a price control like a maximum price which can make the demand curve to now be not this demand curve but be a demand curve like this. So that would make them produce more and charge a lower price and produce more. Another way that we can go about it is simply called marginal cost pricing. What's marginal cost pricing? Marginal cost pricing mein, what we try to do is that you tell them, we don't really want to put a price on you. We just want you to make sure that wherever price equals to, so the AR is your demand curve. So wherever price equals to MC, you charge that price. So that would mean that if this is their marginal cost, rather than producing at this point A, you make them produce at P equals to MC. So you force them to make, rather than produce at Q naught and P naught, you force them to do what we call marginal cost pricing and therefore produce at this point B rather than at point A. Okay, so this is called marginal cost pricing where P equals MC rather than MC is equal to MR. And marginal cost pricing is recommended because it is allocatively efficient. The next idea is this, that marginal cost pricing may not work for natural monopoly, and that's why we need to go do what we call average cost pricing. It's a good opportunity to revise what is a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly would be electric, public utilities, and the reason why they call natural monopoly is because they enjoy economies of scale throughout the length of the demand curve. Like throughout the demand curve, they have what we call economies of scale. What do we mean by this? So like a diagram that we'll make is for a natural monopoly, this is my demand curve, this is my MR. The marginal cost, the average cost is falling throughout. So my ATC looks like this. I'm not. I'm not making this part of my ATC because it's not relevant. But my ATC continuously fall. When my ATC continuously fall, this means I'm enjoying economies of scale. Make sense? Now, what's the advantage of these kind of firms? Basically, if they produce at this point P, if they produce here, then in this case they will give you the lowest possible price. Let's call this P1 and Q1. But if they decide to maximize profits, the problem would be that when ATC is falling, MC is below. So MC might be like this. Okay, let's extend this demand curve a little. So MC might be like this. The MC is equal to MR would mean they might produce at Q0 and therefore charge a huge price. You don't want that to happen. You want consumers to have a lower price. But what if you ask them to do marginal cost pricing? So if I zoom here, if you want them to do marginal cost pricing, that would mean, so you don't want them to be at A, you want them to be at B, but why not ask them to be producing here like C, where demand is equal to MC, price equals to MC. The problem is this, at C, let's call this quantity Q3, the firm will make actually an economic loss, because at C, what is happening is this, that this is my price, but my MC is on the green curve. So all this would mean, this would be my economic loss. When price is lower than ATC, I'm making a loss. Either I can give them a subsidy or tell them fine, because P equals to MC, when P is equal to MC, your price is less than ATC, you make a loss. Don't produce at that point, produce at P equals to ATC, where your MC might be below. So in the case of natural monopoly, we allow, in the case of natural monopoly, we can allow P equals to ATC, or we can allow them to make normal profit. Or if we make them do a P equals to MC, we may need to subsidize the amount. But that's one thing which is possible. So in a natural monopoly case where ATC is continuously falling, you allow price equals to ATC or normal profit. The next discussion is basically to do with price discrimination. Price discrimination, if you quickly do this, is of 3 degrees. The first degree, second and third degree. Price discrimination, definition of price discrimination is when a producer charge a different price for reasons not associated with cost. So it's not the cost that is making you charge a different price, it's that you want to make probably more money. Your revenue may go up and you charge a different price. In the first degree price discrimination, a consumer is charged a price he or she is willing to pay. In other words, if the producer knows exactly what you're willing to pay and he can charge you that price, that's what we call first degree price discrimination, which would mean this is the most profitable kind of a price discrimination, as the consumer surplus is converted into producer surplus. How do I show that in terms of a diagram? So let's say this is my demand curve and this is my marginal cost. If I'm not doing price discrimination, I may, let's say this is 5, I may charge for every unit the same price of, let's say, $5. Okay, this is flat pricing, my total revenue would be 25. But let's say I know exactly now what everyone is paying or what everyone is willing to pay. So the first consumer comes to me, he's willing to pay much more. so I charge him 9. The second guy who comes to me, he's willing to pay a little lower, I charge him 8. Or the third unit, I charge, for example, 7, and the fourth unit, I charge, for example, 6. So what happens here? Now my total revenue would be 9 plus 8 plus 7 plus 6 plus 5, which would mean I think it's equal to 35. Each guy I'm charging a separate price, or each time a consumer buy an extra unit, I charge a separate price. My total revenue will end up going up, and this area, green area, which was previously my consumer surplus, will now be my producer surplus. The only problem is that how would I know consumers' willingness to pay? He won't tell me that. And example that we give for this kind of price discrimination would be, like stall holders in a bazaar, or in a Sunday bazaar, agar aap jaye, so they'll negotiate, they say, Chipaji, aap kitne dengi, itne dengi, and all that kind of thing. They take ages to find out what you're willing to pay. Or even, for example, sometimes at lumps, for example, if you're applying to lumps, they will ask you, if you ask for financial aid, they will give you a big form which will be like how many ACs you have, how many cars you have, what is the salary of your father, give us a whole year electricity bill and all that. With all that information, they know exactly how much your willingness to pay is.
Sir, what about the airline example?
Willing to pay. The consumer isn't really telling you any information, but if he does, then this is what you would do. It's less common to see first degree discrimination happening. Second degree is basically discrimination. Let me zoom it. On the basis of quantity. Like if you look at K Electric does this, that for the first 20 units, they may charge you, for example, $5. For the next sort of 10 units, they may charge you, for example, $10. And for the next, for example, 10 units onward, they may charge you, for example, $20. Why are they charging you more for the incremental unit? Because they notice that if you are a guy who has more than one AC, you might have a consumption on more than 25. This would mean you are richer to pay a higher price. So the richer you are, the more units you will consume, unless you are doing a commercial business at a residential property. Otherwise, you would not be requiring so many units. You must be very rich. Your kitchen might be air conditioned, your bathroom might be air conditioned, the place where your dogs sleep, they're also air conditioned. So you're probably really rich, and that's why you can pay a really high price. So basically, 20 times 5 would mean, what is 20 times 5? 100. 10 times 10 is 100 again, and 20 times 10 is 200. So you make like 400. Versus if you were doing flat pricing, you would have been doing 40 times 5, or 45 is $200. So you can make more money by charging according to different price. Cell phone companies also do this, but they do an opposite pricing. What does cell phone companies do? What cell phone companies do is this, that for the first 5 minutes, the call would be charged, and after 5 minutes, it's free. For example, they encourage you to sort of use more. In this case, they know that more quantity you use, more would be your willingness to pay, and therefore that's why they would be charging you a higher price. For the third degree price discrimination, basically what happens is this: you are charged according to what we say this, that in the third degree we separate the market according to different groups based on their elasticity. This is the most common sort of discrimination. For example, peak hour versus off-peak hour. In the peak hour, we know this, the demand would be more inelastic. While in the off-peak hour, the demand is more elastic. So what we could do is this, that in the peak hour, This is the diagram for that. So in the peak hour, the diagram would be like this. Demand would be very inelastic and MR would be like that. In the off-peak hour, the demand is like this. Okay, so MC is equal to MR. Q1 will be the quantity, price would be P1. In the off-peak hour, I would have a lower price because demand is inelastic. Demand is elastic, so quantity would be Q2. So the idea goes is that my MC is the same, my marginal cost is the same, but I will charge a higher price in this market where the demand is inelastic. Why? Inelastic demand means people are willing to pay more. Elastic demand means people are willing to pay less. So for the same marginal cost, my price is lower in this market versus the price is higher in the other market. And the logic is simply that people are willing to pay more where the demand is more inelastic. Got it? Another example of peak hour versus off-peak hour could be, like when you go for vacation in the summer, the tickets are high, the cost is very high, versus when you go in an off-peak season. Hotels also charge you much more for the same room when you go in a peak season versus off-peak season. Got it? Even like, I don't know what Kareem does it or not, but Uber does this, that if you order a cab or Uber in a peak hour, the rate is very different than when you order Uber or Kareem in an off-peak hour. Peak hour demand is high, the price automatically goes up in their app. Okay, this is the price discrimination. One quick sort of discussion about price discrimination which could be useful is this, that we believe price discrimination could be socially desirable for many reasons. Number one, it's socially desirable because as compared to monopoly, it results in price to fall. Number two, quantity also rises. So it's socially desirable because of that. There will be lower deadweight losses when it comes to price discrimination. Number three, it makes it affordable for some people to buy the good. So we believe that price discrimination could be better than a pure monopoly, because a pure monopoly will never give you a lower price good. But with price discrimination, at least the good is affordable for many people. Okay? So that's the end of monopolies discussion.